Is that all right? Yeah. If
What's
we
this, sorry?
film it,
Well,
so
the
we can
interview.
yeah, so we can script it.
If you would like to.
Is that what? Put that underneath it. When do it start?
In now.
Okay. Yep. Good.
Well, our issue is, should the Human Rights Act 2000 be repealed? Could you just give me a basic overview, your opinions on it, whether you're for or against, or?
Well, clearly it's flawed at the moment in its operation, and that's why the Conservative Party manifesto at the last election called for it to be scrapped. And I think I have serious concerns with how it's working, and you've sort of flagged in your email to me the case of Abu Qatada, and I think there's a lot of disquiet with that case and the way that's operated and the way the Act has been interpreted. So I, as a Conservative politician, am concerned with the way the Act is operating. Now, the Conservatives didn't win the general election. No party won the general election, which is why we're in coalition between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrats, quite understandably, from their perspective, take a different view. And so we've had to change things, and we've got a commission now looking at whether the Act should be repealed. And that's working at the moment. It's put out a consultation. It's had responses to that, I think over 900 or so responses, and then that will come to a view at the end of the year. So we'll wait and see what that comes back with and take it from there.
Okay, there has been talk in the news being the Human Rights Act being replaced with the Bill of Rights. Could you just explain the Bill of Rights and what the effects of it would be?
Well, part of the problem is if you go back to when the human rights legislation was first brought in, well, not the 2000 Act, but if you go back to the 50s, it was Churchill.
1964.
Yeah, so 50s, 60s. The original intention was a perfectly laudable one, but the world has changed quite a bit, and what we've now got is unelected judges actually making decisions and often interpreting things which I think go beyond what politicians actually intended. And that's having quite a chilling effect and raises issues of democracy, because people sometimes will come to me here, like you are today, and they will say to me as my constituents, well, why is such and such happening? Why can't you deport someone who the government and the security service say is a threat? So if someone were advised by the security service is a national threat, should we not be able to deport them? And unelected judges who don't live in this country are taking a different view and saying, no, we can't deport that person. And that raises questions of democracy, in my view. So that's why we felt there should be a change. The Bill of Rights is to enshrine a fair system in English law, because we feel the interpretations being taken by European judges is not what the British people want.
Okay, one of the issues you touched on was the flaws in the Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
One of them, obviously, is the conflicting rights. That's the reason why Abu Qatada, in some people's opinion, can't be deported. With this Bill of Rights, would the conflicting rights would that be put to fair trial? Would you decide which right overrules another?
There would be fair trial, and of course, any approach taken forward would be, as it has been traditionally in Britain, being through the British courts. If you take Abu Qatada, he got a fair trial in Britain, and the British courts decided he could be extradited. So he's already gone through due process. And then a decision was taken at a European level, which actually, most people have missed this, but even the European Court judgment actually ruled with the British courts on every aspect except one. Their one concern which prevented him being deported was, if you read the judgment, what it says is they were concerned that he would be tried using evidence obtained by torture in Jordan. And that was the impediment that the European Court found on preventing him being deported. So the point, what we're saying is, we have respected courts that are independent, that follow due process, and we should allow them to take the decision rather than having unelected European judges interpreting things that go beyond what we feel the legislation says.
Okay, before the Human Rights Act 2000, to appeal a human rights case, you had to travel to Strasbourg in France to appeal for a case. Removing the Human Rights Act or replacing it with the Bill of Rights, would that be what this country be referred back to?
Well, look, what we're trying to do is say that we want the legislation to enshrine protections for people, but in a way that is in the spirit and the tradition of the freedoms that Britain has long been well regarded around the world for. And that's the idea behind the Bill of Rights. That's what was put forward at the general election. Now, as I said earlier, we didn't win the general election, so we've got a commission. The commission is now looking at that. And it may be we take some of the existing legislation as a starting point, but we look at how we then improve it and inform it better moving forward. So British courts will still have be in the driving seat, but we're just concerned that the European courts are acting in a way that is not what democratically the British people would like to see. And I think if you put it out to most opinion polls, then that's very much the answer you'd get.
So this Bill of Rights will ensure every safety that the Human Rights Act 2000 was brought in to ensure
Well,
there won't be anything that's missed out or.
Well, people will have their people will have their protections. Of course, it's not going to be exactly the same. Otherwise, there'd be no point having something different introduced. So it won't be word for word the same. The fundamental question is: will people have their rights subject to due process, legal process? Will they have fair trial? Will things be done in a legally sound manner? And that, let's be honest about it, happened for many years before we had the European Court making these decisions. So it isn't the case that the only way to get a fair decision is for it to be referred to the European Court of Human Rights.
Okay, so the European Court would have little say in the way British protection of the rights would run, and the English court.
Well, we would like a Bill of Rights, but the difficulty, as I mentioned earlier, is it's now subject to a commission. So Lee Lewis, who's the former Permanent Secretary, is leading on that work. There's a number of constitutional experts working on that and senior figures. So I don't know what it's going to come out with, so we'll have to wait and see, and it may be we have a further chat once it has ruled as to see, well, what it is proposing and what it is the coalition is taking forward. What I'm trying to draw out is there's a difference between what the government may do and what I, as a member of the Conservative Party, would like us to do. And had the Conservative Party won the general election, we would have got rid of this legislation and introduced new legislation. Because we didn't win the election, we've had to compromise as part of the coalition, and this is one of the areas we've had to compromise. There's a commission looking at it, and what I have to do is respect that and then see where that comes out in due course, which will be the end of this year.
Referring back to the case of Abu Qatada, the problem here is the conflicting rights are as a result between two countries. If he went back to his home country, Jordan, he's obligating that he'd be subject to torture or maybe death. Surely having the same human rights throughout every country would solve this problem.
Well, I'm not sure it's totally realistic for us to have the same human rights throughout every country. If you look at what's happening in Syria at the moment, clearly there's extremely disturbing news of terrible acts of violence that are going on. So that's a name that's not achievable if one's realistic about it. So I think that the point with Jordan is the Jordanian government have said that he wouldn't be subject to the death penalty, so there's already been assurances given there. The question that the courts went to was whether he would be tried using evidence obtained from others under torture. And I know James Brockenshire, for example, the security minister, has been out to Jordan. I think the Home Secretary went out recently as well to see if we can get the right assurances that would then allow us to satisfy the ruling of the European Court. Does that make sense in terms of the difference between the Jordanian approach and what it will be both within Britain and Europe?
Yeah. With the Human Rights Act, the only flaw is it's not just conflicting rights. The religious emblem comes into it. In some cases where, say, this one I've got here, where Satara Singh was told her uniform breached a no jewellery policy, which was, I think, wearing a religious bangle. She took her appeal to court and she won the case, and there have been many other cases like this. Informing your Bill of Rights, shouldn't that would that eradicate the school's policy of no jewellery? or would it give it, say, an exclusion for religious cases?
Well, we'll have to see where the commission comes out and what they're proposing. So we've got to wait till they rule on that. I think there's been a number of cases. There was also the case of the British Airways worker with the crucifix, and so there's been controversies of various guises. I think the wider point is that I think legislation has been interpreted by the courts much more draconianly than it was intended. And I think that's what's behind some of these cases. So whether it's under Article 8 and the right to family life, allowing prisoners, convicted killers to then claim that their family life means they can't be deported when they've taken the life of someone else. You know, sometimes these things are being interpreted quite widely. So yes, with jewellery and those sort of issues, you get a mishmash where you get certain rulings in one area, certain rulings in others. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that victims have human rights as well. And I think, again, in terms of my casework and what people write to me, sometimes they feel that people are claiming lots of human rights, whether it's to do with what jewellery they wear or whether it's to do with convicted killers claiming their rights. And actually people often feel that some of the time the victims' human rights are not getting reflected as well.
Looking at the victims' human rights with the case of Abu Qatar again, some people say that he should be sent back to Jordan regardless, and some people call this patriotism, some people call it nationalism. Removing your link to, say, Conservative Party or being an MP, what are your own personal views? What do you think should happen?
My personal view is he should be deported because he's seen as a threat to national security, which is a very grave situation. Now, he's been quite careful in a lot of the way he's operated in order to not to operate within certain constraints. So he's been quite clever in the way he's operated. But all the advice, and this is not just the Conservative Party, the Labour Party. If I was in the House of Commons for the debate on this issue, and the statement was made by the Home Secretary, and I remember Jack Straw and Alan Johnson, who are two very senior and respected Labour politicians that I have a lot of time for, and both of them said this man is a threat to our national security. So this isn't just a Conservative issue. The Labour Party, when they were in power, tried to deport him to Jordan and were prevented from doing so by the European judges. And a new government's come in, a coalition government, and they have tried to deport him. So it's not a party political issue, but you said, what's my personal view? My personal view is he should be deported.
I share the same personal view. I do think he should. I do think he should be deported.
Yeah.
But obviously, human rights impedes that.
Yes.
What would your ideas be on, say, a national vote for and against him being deported?
I would be against that, actually. And the reason being is there's a seductive quality to that, and almost a democratic quality to say, well, let's have a referendum, let's put it to the vote. The difficulty with that is cases like these must be decided by due legal process. And so what we've been talking earlier about the Bill of Rights that was proposed by the Conservative Party, the Commission and what legislation they come forward, and in the meantime the existing legislation, that has a legal framework. And I think it would be totally wrong with our long tradition where the British courts are respected and they're independent of politicians. So the politicians will say these are the sentencing guidelines or these are the laws, but then the judges are independent, and that's quite right. I think if you then made it almost like an X factor, do you get deported or do you not? I think we'd be into really difficult waters. So I can understand why people say that and feel they're not being listened to. We feel as MPs, we would like action on this, but at the same time, you can't the courts can't make decisions on what's popular. They must make decisions on what is legally correct and what is fair.
People have called this case with Abu Qatar a mockery to the justice system, because, say, it'll be a very pale comparison, but you compare it to, I can't remember his name now, a man who was, I he was deported to America for making weapons.
Oh, yeah, the recent case, yes, yeah.
I think it's for Syria. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know exactly the case you mean. So, who's in particular highlighted because he's a member of the golf club, and so there's a contrast between the criteria. And he was in a haulage business, I think, an export business with batteries, wasn't he?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So the disbalance between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a very good point there. It's two different issues.
Yeah.
In that he was exported under an extradition treaty we have with the United States, which was introduced, I think, around 2003 by the Labour government. And I have real concerns with that extradition arrangement because it was originally intended for high-profile national security issues around terrorism. It's been interpreted much more widely. Gary McKinnon, for example, the computer hacker. There's been a lot of debate around him. And so it's been interpreted very widely, and it's not balanced. So we are much quicker to extradite people to America, and the American judges don't have to prove their case in the way that would have been the case before the extradition arrangement. So again, I very much can understand why people look at those two cases and say, well, this seems wrong, and I'd agree with them that it's wrong. But they're related but different pieces of legislation.
Again, with the topic of conflicting rights, would you propose an idea to completely reform the Human Rights Act so no rights could conflict, or be no area for confliction, if you understand what I mean? That may sound radical or a bit far-fetched, but if it could be done, would the Conservative Party be taking that approach?
Well, I think it's the job of the courts to often assess. There's often conflicting issues before the courts. If you take much in the news at the moment around hacking, in the journalist case, you've got conflicting rights there between the rights of a free press against the rights of people to privacy.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get to a situation where you can remove all conflicting things. Part of the job of the courts is to assess the weight of competing claims or competing issues and reach a judgment in terms of what is the right legal approach and the right judgment where you've got freedom of press against privacy, to give that as an example. So it's the same in this area. Abu Qatada, like anyone else, has rights that the public, in terms of national security, has rights. You can't remove those conflicting issues, but it's right that the courts make that decision. And I come back to the point, and you were saying about whether it should be put to the public. The British courts decided in favour of deportation with Abu Qatada. So I would argue, in that sense, the British courts had worked. They come to the right decision. The problem was that the European Court then took a different view.
So, removing the Human Rights Act 2000, say that case was, say, retaken, and the HRA had been abolished or repealed, and you had the Bill of Rights, and Europe had no say, Abu Qatada would be deported.
In Jordan, though.
He'd be in Jordan. And would the British be blamed for guilt throughout the media if he was sentenced to death or torture?
Well, as I said, the Jordanians have already given assurances he wouldn't be sentenced to death or tortured. So we have those assurances from the Jordanians. And I think it would be right to deport him.
If you have these assurances of him not being tortured or put to death, why hasn't he been deported?
Because the judgment from the European Court said that he would be tried on the basis of evidence from others, and the evidence was obtained from torture. So in other words, what they're saying is there may be an unfair trial, even though he won't be convicted he won't be executed as a result of the trial, but he might end up spending a long time in jail because, if I give an example, if someone he used to know was tortured and as a result said, yes, Abu Qatada did some very terrible things, and as a result of that, at his trial, that evidence is given weight,